Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, your favorite conservatarian contrarian, Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. And I've got another fire conversation for you today. We're gonna talk about energy, a subject that I know very little about, so I think this is gonna be great. Before we get into all of that, be sure to like this video, share this video, and if you haven't already subscribed, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button right now. Hit that notification bell. I'm watching you. Watch it. I need you to hit that button. Do it. Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Also, if you want to support my work, all the links are in the show notes. You got the PayPal app, the Venmo app, the CashApp, all the appity app apps. Every little bit counts. It helps me to bring you this wonderful content, which I upload every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. So before I also get into the interview, I want to remind you that LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. Check out LibertyNation.com for all of your conservatarian news, original articles and analysis, videos, podcasts, Liberty Nation Radio, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback. Now, without further ado, I would like to bring on my guest. He is a law professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And if I have it correctly, you specialize in energy law. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Energy, especially energy transport and trade, but really the whole spectrum from oil and gas to electricity, renewables, whatever kind of energy you're interested in.
All right. So if it has to do with the law and energy, James W. Coleman is your man. So this is a very particularly interesting subject, especially right now with what America is going through. But before we get into all that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, like how you got into the field and, you know, what a typical day looks like for you in doing what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I started interested in science. So I got my biology degree at Harvard, and there I was studying actually butterfly genetics. So that was sort of an odd area. I was traipsing across Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Russia, catching butterflies and sequencing their DNA and figuring out how they were related to each other. But anyway, I'm one of those weird people that always knew they wanted to be a professor. I really enjoy the research. I really enjoy teaching, all of that. And so my mentor, the professor that I worked for at Harvard, she kind of encouraged me, you should go and get a biology PhD. I really like that work, but it was, if you want to do a science PhD, it's got to be very focused. I mean, you'd spend your whole life studying butterflies, and that's super interesting in a way, but I was kind of interested in broader policy questions. And so that's why I decided I wanted to be a law professor. I went to law school. So when I went to law school, I knew I wanted to, so I actually taught high school physics for a couple of years outside of DC, went back to law school, and there back at Harvard, wasn't sure if I wanted to get into energy law or maybe intellectual property, something involving science. And what I found is I really was very interested in energy law. I started at Sidley. My first law job was at Sidley Austin, big law firm in Washington, D.C. That was at the start of the Obama administration when there was a lot of energy and climate, both legislation, regulation, et cetera, working its way through Congress and the agencies. And so that was a great introduction to the field of energy law. Went back to Harvard Law School to teach as a lecturer there for 2 years, and my first professor gig at the business school and law school at the University of Calgary in Canada, which is huge. They always say it's the Texas of Canada. It's the big energy center there. And then moved down to SMU in 2016. So that's, I'm originally a Minnesotan. My first time living in Texas was when I came down here to SMU in Dallas, but I wasn't sure what I think, and I love it. I really enjoy it. So yeah, and my, as with most professors, basically, I teach some classes. I teach energy law, I teach oil and gas, I teach energy transport and trade. But then, of course, the bulk of your time is spent doing research, and I write a lot about some of the different challenges for energy companies facing, regulation from different governments around the world, as well as the expectations of their investors, and think about how we can address those trade-offs that we face in the energy system between having affordable energy, having cleaner energy, and having security in our global energy system. So that's that's the focus of my work.
Yeah, that's quite a story. I mean, from butterflies to energy law. So I have to. Do you ever miss the butterflies? Do you ever,
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely interesting. Honestly, currently, the Russia-Ukraine thing is so sad because a lot of these places were places that I went and they're beautiful. I mean, beautiful places, very really interesting history and culture, and so it's obviously very sad to see all the destruction there.
Sure.
I did get a species named after me.
Really?
So yeah, a subspecies. So here, I don't know if you can see, but here's my little Agrodaitis repartii colemani. I have those little reminders of my time with the butterflies there. But no, I don't. I'm quite happy to focus on energy law now.
Yeah, well, that's pretty cool. I mean, having a subspecies named after you, like nobody can. I mean, very few people can say that. So that is an accomplishment. So kudos to you. But let's go ahead and get into it. I mean, you just kind of mentioned kind of the tension between relying on fossil fuels, but also wanting to move more towards alternative energy sources. And you recently wrote an op-ed in Real Clear Politics that kind of discusses that. And it kind of taught me some things I didn't know. I like the way you broke it down because I am a layperson, but it did make it a little bit easier for me to understand. But I want to ask you, when you're talking about the use of natural gas and electricity as alternative to fossil fuels, this is a two-part question, but I'll just ask the first part first. So can you kind of break down that dichotomy there for like the layperson?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to understand that really, the basic lot of humanity didn't ever improve until we got to the Industrial Revolution. So, 1650, Hobbes says, human life is, nasty, brutish, and short. And frankly, that really hadn't changed. Life expectancy, nothing had changed. Everything changes with the Industrial Revolution. And what drives the Industrial Revolution and economic growth through the end of the 20th century is our use of more energy. And it really takes two big forms. One is coal power for machines and eventually for electricity, and then eventually oil for transport. That allows it, because oil carries so much energy in such a small space, it's so energy dense, you can have the energy to carry with you to drive your car 500 miles. And that was, that really wouldn't work with wood or other things. And that energy density of those two sources was their huge advantage. So, if you look at medieval towns, they are basically only so big that you can carry in wood to heat the town, right? But when you have increased use of coal, all of a sudden it allows you to just bring it into the city, pile it up, and you can form industry where you need it. And so really the rise of the modern city, the rise of modern civilization comes with that increased use of coal and oil. And so I think what people need to understand about those sources is that really built the modern world. They're the reason that we live, over 80 years instead of, 40 years. They are, the real advantage of them is that they're easy to transport and store. Even when coal was developed, it wasn't necessarily a cheaper source of power than like the old mills that were along, rivers or anything or the windmills that you see. It was basically, those windmills and those river mills were just wherever they were, and you couldn't concentrate them in cities. You couldn't build modern cities, etc. And certainly you couldn't carry it with you in a car to transport you. And so that all really is developed by oil and coal. Now, obviously, we made a lot of progress, and there are large parts of the country, and some nations that have basically been able to kind of move beyond coal because they've developed other sources of energy, whether that's nuclear energy they've developed, or a lot of hydropower, or a combination, as we mostly have here in Texas and many places in the United States, of natural gas and renewable energy. Now, unfortunately, the challenge with these sources, I think everybody needs to understand, is if you put energy sources on a continuum from the dirtiest, coal and oil, to the cleanest natural gas, right? Coal and oil, don't burn them in your house. Natural gas, many of us burn it in our house. That's fine. And then electricity, with no emissions in your house. That continuum, unfortunately, is the same continuum from easy to transport and store coal and oil to difficult to transport and store natural gas and electricity. And so if we're going to develop those sources, it's going to take natural gas and electricity. Basically, the only way to transport those is through multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, big power lines crisscrossing the country, big natural gas pipelines crisscrossing the country. And I think one challenge we've seen is that we were making a lot of progress in replacing those dirtier sources when it was easier to build infrastructure. But one challenge we've seen growing over the past decade is it's getting harder and harder to build that infrastructure sources to those linear infrastructure, power lines and pipelines to power that new transition. And so sometimes I think people, when you read about big infrastructure stories, you might read about Keystone XL or Dakota Access Pipeline, which are oil pipelines. And I think what's important to understand is, approving or not approving those are a big deal, and it can impact the affordability of oil products, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the oil industry is going to work one way or another, because you can ship things by tanker, you can ship things by rail, et cetera. But when natural gas pipelines don't get built and when power lines don't get built, there's no other way for those newer energy sources to reach us. And that creates some fragility to the energy system as we kind of move to those cleaner sources. I think we are moving, we'll continue to move more to those cleaner sources. And even if we don't get rid of those old sources, we'll be building more of those new sources as our energy needs grow. I think it's important for people to understand that that's just a much bigger challenge in terms of the infrastructure that we'll need. And it will make the system in some ways more fragile because there's just not the flexibility of oil and coal where you can ship it to wherever you need it.
I see. So that makes sense. I mean, with coal and oil, it's much easier to transport, much easier to work with, whereas we haven't made those advances yet with electricity and natural gas to be able to make it as easy and cheap to transport and to go over long distances. Now, here's something I always hear people say when it comes to specifically to electricity. They're talking about, people just go out and buy a Tesla if you don't like gas prices and stuff like that. But even to generate that electricity before it's stored, don't you need fossil fuels to do that? Or are they using other sources like windmills, like you mentioned, or others, or solar power?
Well, it really depends on where you are, right? There are places like, in Asia and China where they use about 80% coal. So yeah, it's mostly fossil fuels. Now, of the energy that gets to the car, electricity is a particularly efficient way to transport the car. So they use a little bit less energy overall, right? And if you could power it from clean sources, that's great. But yeah, absolutely, you need to have that electricity available. And I think there's two important things to understand. One is if you're talking about like the cost to charge your vehicle, that in the United States, because we have low electricity prices currently, is substantially less than the cost to fill your car with a tank of gasoline. But I think there's a couple things to understand. One is prices for electricity in the US are very low. That's not necessarily the norm other places. And unfortunately, those prices for electricity are going up. And are likely to go up a lot, frankly, in the United States. We have benefited from, over a decade of low natural gas prices and low interest rates that have kept electricity prices very low here in the United States. Both of those things are going up. I expect we're going to see, big increases in that going forward. The other thing to keep in mind is because electricity markets are simply less flexible than oil markets and gasoline markets because it's so hard to transport. And the result of that is that you get outages in electricity market. I mean, even in your home, like how often do you go to your gas station and they're out of gas? It rarely happens, but we all know with outages and we had almost a week of outages in Texas. And you can imagine that if our
I lived through that. That was not fun.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I did too. It got down to 37 degrees a couple times here in the house.
Yeah.
But think about how much fragility that would add to our system if more and more of our transport is based on electricity. If you have electricity go out for 4 days, it's bad enough if you can get in your car and drive somewhere else. But if you can't drive anywhere else because there's no electricity to charge your car, and, even worse, if government or emergency vehicles started to be dependent on electricity and they can't reach people because of the grid going out, basically we are putting all of our eggs in one basket with that electricity basket. And it's important to understand how inflexible that electricity system is, right? If we start using a lot more oil, we can have it shipped to us from all over the world relatively affordably. But in that crisis where we were all out of power for 4 days, there was really very little that anyone around us could do to help us. And we're seeing, I hope we don't see that problem this summer, but we might. We're already seeing, warnings that we might have outages throughout this summer. And in fact, we're having more outages over time. So we're basically piling more and more of our energy needs into the system that is quite fragile and seems to be growing more fragile. And so I think, it's just important for people to understand there's a lot of benefits to cleaner sources and not burning as much oil in our cities and, every gas tank, because that contributes to urban air pollution. There's a lot of benefits, but people need to really understand the big downsides for our energy security overall, and the fragility that's adding to the system. And think about that when we're thinking about what's the pace at which we want to make this transition.
Yeah. And you know what? I think what you just said, most people don't know. I think, because I really didn't know until I read your article. And to me, I think it's people to say, oh yeah, let's just go to alternative energy. Let's just go to electricity, natural gas. But it sounds like let's say if we waved a magic wand and we did that tomorrow, based on the technology that we have right now and the way our infrastructure is, we could be putting ourselves in a very precarious situation. And I think that people don't really understand that when we're talking about these things. And honestly, the government's not going to mention how risky that is. Would that be fair would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think people don't realize how what we're asking of the energy system is just, as an engineering matter, a very, very difficult thing to do. And, I think it's also important. One thing I often hear, and this is true, that solar and wind are often the cheapest source of electricity. And so people say, oh, great. Well, solar and wind, it's clean and it's cheaper, so let's just use that. But what people, I think, don't understand about the electricity system is electricity is very fragile. It's not like oil, where you can just say, oh, we'll produce more this month, less next month. We'll store what we need. If we have a shortage, we'll get it from somebody else. No, the way the electricity system works is every second, it has to exactly match how much power is being produced by all your different sources of energy with how much is being demanded every time that your air conditioning kicks up, every time that your dishwasher turns on, every time that you plug in your phone, every time you plug in your electric vehicle. And if those things ever get at all out of balance, even for seconds, it's a huge problem for the grid. So, one contrast that I draw is that if you take all of last year, we saw oil prices run up. Well, why was that? Well, that was because the world was producing only 98 million barrels a day of oil, but it was consuming 100 million. So 100 versus 98. It was consuming 2% more than it was producing every day last year. Well, how is that even possible? Well, why didn't we run out of oil? Well, because oil is stored all over the world. So the world was living off of its stores of oil for that entire time. Okay. Now we basically got through it. You still could get gasoline even though the prices rose. Now think about the electricity system by contrast. In Texas, what caused those 4 days of blackouts? Well, basically what happened is we had 4.5 minutes, just 4.5 minutes, where the frequency was 1% short. So we just had we had tiny imbalance in how much was being provided and demanded for just over 4 minutes, and that took down the entire grid for 4 days. And I think that's
Wait, you're telling me that because of 4 minutes of having 1% less, that a bunch of us froze and turned into popsicles.
Right, exactly. Because that's the electricity system is simply more fragile. So the way it works is, okay, so electricity on the grid is on alternating current. So it goes, so every 60 seconds, it oscillates 60 times every second, 60 hertz, right? And so, and it has to stay right at that because every machine, you know, there are motors spinning, there's every turbine spinning, there's everything attached to the grid spins at the same frequency, and it's designed to spin at the same frequency. Now, if that frequency deviates a little, 59.9, okay, it's a problem, but we can get back to 60. But if it gets down to where it got down to, 59.3, okay, so about 1% off, and that was because it was a little bit more power being pulled off than being put on, right? If it gets down to that level, the everything breaks. All those machines can break. In fact, those machines are basically programmed. They're allowed to, and so they do cut themselves off from the grid to protect their power plant if it stays at that level for 9 minutes. So in other words, there is a and that's why people say we were 4 minutes from disaster or 5 minutes from disaster, because what would have happened, basically with the grid being a little bit off of frequency, already power plants were starting to just shut down or turn off from the grid, right? Wow. And that started a chain reaction because, of course, that meant there was even less power provided. And so that meant the frequency got even more out of control. And so basically there was that imbalance meant that power plants started tripping off. That started a number of chain reactions in the system. And to get the power grid back into balance, it took 4 days. And obviously statewide, blackouts statewide. And if it had been for 4.5 more minutes, there probably would have been a system-wide blackout, could have taken weeks or even, months to recover from. And so that's how fragile the system is, right? The oil system can go a year with a complete imbalance in how much oil is provided. And it's bad because we have higher prices, et cetera, but we can live with it. In the electricity system, you can't live with it. It's just a much more fragile system. And so when people say, okay, why don't we just go to solar and wind? Well, remember, solar and wind, we don't have any control about when those produce electricity.
Exactly.
So imagine trying to get people to exactly match as that solar and wind power jumps up and down as clouds go over or as the wind drops a little bit, and you have to get everybody, okay, quick, everybody, turn on your light, turn off your light, etc. That's what you would have to do. In fact, it simply wouldn't work, right? And one challenge is that neither solar nor wind provides typically that much energy in the early evening hours, which is when the peak of electricity demand comes. Or, unfortunately, during winter cold, if a cold front just sits over, typically there's not much wind either. So if you look during that storm, basically wind, which normally provides 25% of Texas electricity, went down to 2%. And so it simply is not possible. You need to have other sources that provide that electricity. So, when people say, well, why isn't wind and solar cheaper? And that is true, in the same sense that it is cheaper to hitchhike than to own a car, right? And so it is cheaper, and it might be more environmentally responsible to hitchhike than to own a car. Though. But if you need to get somewhere, if you need to be sure that you're going to get somewhere, if you want to make sure that your medical machines work at the hospital, if you want to make sure that your heat works in the winter, if you want to make sure it's not really an option, right? There needs to be other things to back up the system. And one thing, unfortunately, our policies are making it a little bit more fragile in this sense. So the reliable source of electricity that we count on in practice, yes, we've added a lot of solar and wind, but that means we can't count on them. We know they might go out at any time. And so we have to have natural gas backup. So it doesn't really allow you to shut down very many power plants. Mostly it just means, okay, solar and wind run as much as possible. We'll try not to run our fossil fuel plants, but when they go out, fossil fuel plants, you better be ready to ramp up to 100%
they have to kick in
of demand, right? And that's just a challenge, a big engineering challenge, because you can think about that, right? If you were planning to build a power plant, you said, okay, am I going to get paid for this electricity? They said, well, we'd like to pay you as little as possible. We want you to run almost never. But when we desperately need power, you better be prepared to meet 100% of the supply. I mean, that's a challenge. And often, I mean, in practice, what it means is for these natural gas power plants is, hey, I expect you to lose money every day for the next 10 years until there's a big storm, and I want you to make it all back in that week. And think about that. If you were going to invest a couple, tens of millions on that kind of investment, it's a challenge. And I think we can do it, and we have done it to a large extent, but it will get more challenging the more we try to tell those natural gas power plants, I want you always 100% ready to go, but I want to use you as little as possible.
Okay, so yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, and that actually gives me a lot more clarity on this issue, because, like I said, most of what you're saying, I don't think that most people know. What about nuclear energy? I mean, that used to be a big topic a while ago, and now it seems like not even Republicans are really bringing this up anymore. But wouldn't that be a potential viable alternative other than wind energy and solar energy, which is unpredictable, unreliable, and a lot more risky? Or are there issues with nuclear energy that I don't know about?
No, I think if you were talking about just the environmental performance and the safety of energy sources, nuclear is your best bet. I mean, certainly its safety record over the decades is by far the best. And so, yeah, if that's all you're concerned with. But the other thing we're concerned about is affordability. And I think it's important to understand that for all the problems with our natural gas and renewable based grid that we're moving towards, it is cheap. And so it is, and so we're seeing, even with nuclear power plants that were built decades ago. So you think, okay, well, they tend to be cheaper, they should be able to keep running. Sometimes they're needing financial assistance to go forward. And another challenge in the United States is that the nuclear power plants, like most things, they get cheaper the more you build, right? If you can build them in real volume, they get cheaper. But the process for actually financing them is dependent on utility rates that are really set in state by state systems. So there's not really like any one state that's going to go out and build 20 nuclear power plants. I mean, really, the only place that is adding that kind of much load would be someplace maybe like Texas, but Texas is absolutely, the center of cheap natural gas, wind, and solar power. So I think when people think about energy, the other thing that sometimes people come and say to me is, well, couldn't we have, all these other sources of energy? Can't we just go straight to geothermal or straight to tidal power and all of those things? And those are all good ideas, and they may be part of our solutions. I think nuclear will be too. But it's important to understand there are parts that are, engineering problems, but there are parts that are like, yeah, we could technically do it, but this is about prices. And, electricity prices have only started to go up, and you're already seeing lots of newspaper articles about it. They're going to go up a lot more. And it's going to be a huge challenge. I mean, and we've seen, with the Biden administration, they came into office with a bunch of plans that were incredibly ambitious in terms of shutting down fossil fuel energy, et cetera. And the second there was an increase in prices, all of a sudden the rhetoric changed a lot. And I think now they seem very conflicted. It doesn't seem like they know what they want to do. But so I think that's just the reality that we have to be ready for. Yeah, you could transition to a lot more nuclear power. Yes, if you built enough power plants, eventually the cost would go down, but there'd be a lot of higher costs in the meantime. And it turns out these energy costs are very politically salient.
So it might hurt a little bit at first, but then pricing would go down. But then it sounds like people don't want
to. I can't offer any promises either. I think it's
that's true too.
Because what's happened instead is that most of the efforts to build nuclear power plants, because it's kind of one-off, they've run into problems, been way over budget. Some of them have been canceled, and so then it's kind of I don't even know if we have the political will to push through to build a lot of nuclear power plants and eventually lower the cost. So I don't know. We could see or not. I mean, and the other reality is, if if you don't make too aggressive your goals in terms of more renewable energy, I think natural gas and renewable energy in combination can provide affordable electricity. We just need to maybe build a bigger margin of safety. One problem that Texas had was it really hasn't built enough margin of safety for increased demand, and they keep underestimating how many people are moving to Texas, how much electricity they're going to use, how much the economy is going to grow, because Texas has continued just to have amazing economic growth over the last decade.
So last question, and and when I've talked about this issue before, I've asked other people this question too. So I kind of want to get your reaction to it. When the whole Ukraine and Russia thing, when that popped off, and people were talking about energy independence, the response from the Biden administration and also Democrats in Congress was, oh, well, we want to be energy independent, so we need to just start moving towards green energy or renewable energy and ditch these fossil fuels. Now, I haven't met anybody who doesn't think that it would be a good idea to transition to more renewable energy at some point. But we recognize that's going to take a while, because you actually just laid out the challenges associated with that. So we need to develop the technology and the engineering and the innovation to make that happen. That's decades down the road. So wouldn't the common sense solution to be, let's go ahead and work on that. But in the meantime, let's drill for our own oil. Let's use these fossil fuels until we get to that point to where we can transition safely. Am I missing something with that, or is that a little bit too?
No, I completely agree. Yeah, and obviously, to the extent that we start to have more success in building up this green infrastructure, then maybe we can restrain some of our traditional infrastructure. But the reality is, we're way behind in all of our transport infrastructure in the United States. I'm not sure people appreciate. If you go back to the real start of the interstate oil transport system, when it really gets its big boost is during World War II. German U-boats, submarines are sinking oil tankers along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And so the United States says, let's build as an emergency measure 2 big oil pipelines between Texas and the East Coast, the Big Inch and Little Inch pipelines. Okay, so those were built in a matter of months during World War II as an emergency measure. Those pipelines are still in service today. If we were building pipelines at a reasonable pace in this country, there's no way we would continue to use pipelines built as an emergency measure during World War II. So we have this big infrastructure deficit. We need to be replacing, building new oil pipelines to replace old ones, building new natural gas pipelines to make our natural gas system more flexible, building new electric transmission lines to make increase the renewable energy that we could use, as well as hydropower from Canada. We need more of all these kinds of infrastructure. And unfortunately, when you look at the legal changes that are happening, we're making it more difficult to build basically all kinds of infrastructure. And so I think there's going to really need to be a sea change in terms of the way that administrations and Congress look at this, to move to a system where we can build the infrastructure that we need to have a more resilient energy system with more affordable and smooth prices, but also to transition more reliance to these cleaner sources.
Okay. Yeah. What you just said right there, that could be a whole other episode. Maybe we can do this again and kind of drill down more on that, because I would like to know more. But I really appreciate you spending time with me. You even just in the short period of time, you have educated me quite a bit. But before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me. I'm at Energy Law Prof on Twitter. Also at Energy Law Prof on YouTube, if you like those videos. And plus I have a blog, which is energylawprof.com. So all easy to find.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining the program.
All right. Thank you.
And for you guys, don't forget to head on over to libertynation.com, a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective, where you can sign up for the daily briefing, subscribe to the member zone, or you can just check out all the latest cutting edge conservatarian news and analysis with none of the spin and all the nuance. You can read my stuff. You can read my colleagues' stuff. It'll be great. Check out new and original material on libertynation.com, where truth is making a comeback.